On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic had lost contact with Moscow for days. Its crew believed nuclear war had already begun. The captain ordered a nuclear torpedo armed and ready to fire. Two of the three officers required to authorize launch said yes. The third said no. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. If he had said yes, the city you are sitting in right now almost certainly would not exist. This is the story of the 13 days that almost ended the world, and the near misses that had nothing to do with the decisions being made by the men in charge. America's involvement began not with missiles, but with mistakes. The Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961, a CIA-organized attempt to overthrow Castro, failed catastrophically. Castro survived. Khrushchev drew a conclusion. The United States would try again with full military force. His response was to make that invasion impossible. Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil aimed at American cities capable of striking Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. Castro accepted. The missiles began arriving in the summer of 1962. American U-2 aircraft photographed them on October 14th. Kennedy was briefed October 16th. He had 13 days before they became fully operational. Every option his advisors presented carried a significant probability of nuclear war. But here is what the XCOM didn't know. What the CIA and Pentagon didn't know was what was already on the island. And what was already there changed everything. The CIA's intelligence picture of Cuba was dangerously incomplete. When Soviet archives opened after the Cold War ended, the true picture emerged. And what it showed is that if Kennedy had followed his general's advice and invaded Cuba, nuclear war would have been almost certain. Here is why. The Soviets had not just sent strategic missiles to Cuba. They had deployed approximately 43,000 Soviet military personnel, 4 times the CIA's estimate. They had deployed tactical nuclear weapons, short-range Luna missiles with nuclear warheads, already transferred to Soviet field commanders in Cuba with pre-authorization to use them if the United States invaded. Those tactical weapons were not under Moscow's command. They were in the hands of field commanders who could use them without waiting for orders. The Joint Chiefs recommended invasion throughout the 13 days. Kennedy resisted. The declassified record shows that if he had followed that advice, Soviet field commanders had both the weapons and the authority to respond with nuclear strikes against the invasion force within hours. Kennedy didn't know this. The XCOM didn't know this. They were making decisions about nuclear war with a fundamentally incomplete picture. And that was before the submarines. 4 Soviet submarines were dispatched toward Cuba. Each carried 1 nuclear torpedo with a yield approximately equal to the Hiroshima bomb. Launch required authorization from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. On submarine B-59, those 3 men were Captain Savitsky, political officer Maslenikov, and flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov. By October 27th, B-59 had been submerged and out of radio contact with Moscow for days. The crew had no way of knowing whether nuclear war had begun. American naval vessels were dropping depth charges around them, practice charges intended as a signal to surface, but indistinguishable from actual attack charges to a crew who didn't know the protocol. Captain Savitsky concluded war had begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Maslenikov agreed. 2 of 3 required authorizations were in place. Vasily Arkhipov said no. He argued they had no confirmation of actual hostilities, and that launching without orders from Moscow was not within their authority. The argument lasted long enough for the submarine to surface. American vessels were waiting. The torpedo was never fired. The full story didn't emerge until the 1990s. When Robert McNamara heard it at a conference in 2002, he said that Vasily Arkhipov had saved the world. Arkhipov died in 1998. He received no formal recognition from the Soviet or Russian government. Arkhipov prevented nuclear war on October 27th. On the same day, in a completely separate incident, an American U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace. Soviet interceptors scrambled. American fighters launched to escort it out. armed with nuclear missiles because conventional weapons weren't loaded. Kennedy wasn't told for hours. A third incident on the same day could have triggered a military response Kennedy's own advisors later said would have escalated to full conflict. October 27, 1962 was the most dangerous day in human history. Not because of what Kennedy and Khrushchev decided, but because of what they couldn't control. October 27th, Black Saturday, produced 3 separate near misses within hours. First, the B-59 confrontation. Second, the U-2 over Soviet airspace. American F-102 interceptors launched to escort it out were carrying nuclear-tipped Falcon missiles because conventional weapons weren't available. If a confrontation had occurred, the American response would have involved nuclear weapons. Kennedy reportedly said, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." Third, American U-2 pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SAM missile and killed. The ExComm had previously agreed that a U-2 shootdown would require an immediate military response. Kennedy overruled the protocol unilaterally. His advisors later said following it would have escalated to full military conflict within 24 hours. 3 incidents, 1 day, none ordered by either government. The men in charge were not in control of all the variables. The crisis ended through a back channel most people have never heard of. The public resolution, Soviets remove missiles, America pledges not to invade Cuba, was real. What was not made public was the second part. America would secretly remove its Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey within 6 months. That secret term was negotiated not through official diplomatic channels, but through ABC News correspondent John Scali, who was approached by a Soviet KGB officer and used as an intermediary. The Kennedy administration concealed the Turkey component for years because it would look like a concession to nuclear blackmail. The declassified documents confirmed it in the 1980s. The crisis ended not because one side blinked, but because both sides gave each other something they needed, publicly and secretly, without either having to admit what they were actually doing. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The world didn't. But here is what the crisis revealed about nuclear weapons that both governments understood and chose not to fully fix. And the second time an individual officer saved the world from accidental nuclear war 20 years later, almost nobody heard about that either. The crisis produced 2 reforms: the Moscow-Washington hotline, direct communication between American and Soviet leadership, installed in 1963. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1963, both real improvements. Neither addressed the fundamental problem. Nuclear weapons were distributed across submarines, aircraft, and missile batteries under commanders with varying degrees of independent authority to use them. The B-59 near launch had shown that the most dangerous moment in nuclear history almost happened without any decision made in Washington or Moscow. The reform that was needed, ensuring no individual below the highest government level had independent nuclear launch authority, was never fully implemented. Field commanders argued centralized control would fail in an actual nuclear exchange. The argument was accepted. In 1983, 20 years later, Soviet early warning satellites incorrectly detected 5 American ICBMs in flight. Protocol required an immediate alert to the highest levels of government. The duty officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, judged it a false alarm and didn't report it. He was correct. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had fooled the system. If Petrov had followed protocol, the Soviet response could have been nuclear. Like Arkhipov, he received no recognition. He was quietly reprimanded for failing to follow procedure. At the 2002 conference in Havana, McNamara heard the full B-59 account for the first time. He said, at 85 years old, 40 years after the crisis, that it was a miracle nuclear war had not occurred. The former Secretary of Defense of the United States used the word miracle. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not end because Kennedy was strong and Khrushchev blinked. It ended because Vasily Arkhipov said no, because Stanislav Petrov trusted his judgment over his instruments, because a navigation error didn't escalate, because the secret deal held. Any one of those variables going differently, any single individual making a different choice, and the outcome changes. The world survived not because of the men in charge. It survived because of the men they didn't know about. 13 days, 3 near misses on a single afternoon, a secret deal hidden for decades, a submarine officer no one had heard of, a duty officer who trusted his instincts over his instruments. The nuclear weapons are still there. The command and control systems are still imperfect. The lesson was never fully learned. Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. He died without recognition. History's dark archives. The men in charge are never the whole story. History's dark archives. The men in charge are never the whole story.